arrangementy things to make, but again, half of you aren't here, so I'll wait for a bit. Then probably the other half won't be here. Anyway, what we're looking at today, this is a couple of, well, first of all I should mention, I did spot my deliberate mistake on the schedule of classes. I think it's because I lifted it off a regular winter type course, which was 1 week less than the summer one. So anyway, this week we're doing Grunewald and Cranach, with probably a bit of Dura thrown in, see how far we go. Next week will be all Dura, and there's nobody's tidily fitting into one slot at this point. But the other artist, on August the 10th, the main artist then, oh no, wait a minute, yeah, that'll be either the 10th or the 15th. Holbein, I didn't even put Holbein on the list, and he's one of my superstar painters. Mostly because of one amazingly extraordinary picture, but if any of you ever had ambitions to be portrait painters, he's your guy. Either look at him or, how much of them passing Ingres, 19th century French painter. Look him up when you get home, just Google Ingres portraits and just blow yourself out, because he's just amazing. You alright?
Yeah.
Is there something I said? Put your hands up like that. Hey, do that. No, true, honestly. It's like they do in kindergarten, little children are choking. You do that and you straighten out all your tubes. You don't believe me, do you? You just don't want to look like an idiot. Well, I don't care, obviously. So anyway, that's what's coming up. So the major artist, well, Grunewald is, as we'll see, there's one extraordinary important thing. Cranach is just kind of interesting. I'll whip through him quite quickly. Dura is, next to Van Eyck, the most important artist in the entire course, because he's new and he's different, and he actually thinks about art, I think, more than some of the others. And then Holbein is just amazing. What Holbein is good at is he's in the 16th century, but he sort of inherits the technical genius of Van Eyck, painting in oil, painting meticulous tiny detail, lots of stubble and that sort of thing. But also he's living at the time of Leonardo da Vinci, who decides that a portrait should be more than just the outside of you, it should be the inside, it should show the movement of the soul, he said, something like that. So again, Holbein is the best of both worlds in a way. He's wonderful. The best of all his portraits, some of you may know, it's in the Frick collection. Oh no, you've never been there. None of you have been to New York, have you? When you're in New York, go to the Frick collection on Fifth Avenue, and you'll never be the same again. Honest. So what we're looking at here is, hang on, I thought I had a map. Just to sort of, well, there's a map to show you roughly what we're in for. Because now we're moving into basically Germany, but there wasn't a Germany back then. That's a fairly, like Italy, sort of a 19th century, they just cobbled everybody together, basically. And this is what Germany looked at. Well, you get to some, and there's Venice and Milan down at the bottom, and this is the area we've been in. Up here, Burgundy is essentially shrunk. The free county of Burgundy. That doesn't sound much good. So we saw Burgundy losing political power, but all this area here, sort of Bruges and Brussels, that neighbourhood. But this is the mishmash mess that was the German area. And if you can see, I'm not sure how far I can zoom in, but whoops, not that way. You've got duchies, you've got counties. That's what a county used to be, was ruled over by a count. You've got the Kingdom of Bohemia. Bohemia was not just hippies, it was kind of a grand cultural place. Kingdom of Poland. But over here still, and you've got electorates, as we'll see, there were people, the Holy Roman Emperor was essentially hereditary, blood, dynastic stuff, but there were electors who were the heads of the principal areas, and they got to sort of choose, kind of. Bishoprics, so there's a real mess of political power in this area, and this actually, in the 16th century, the famous Emperor Charles V just got sick of the whole thing, and he abdicated in about 1555 or so. gave the empire to his brother. He got to be Holy Roman Emperor, and his son Philip II of Spain. The bigger. I mentioned him last time. We were looking at Bruegel. You know, the atrocities in the Spanish Netherlands, all trying to kill off the naughty Protestants. And Charles V just goes and retires and lives in Spain in a monastery and reads books, and because he's just sick of all the squabbling between all these various sects. Because it's not just political, it's also religious, because in this is the part of Europe that is most affected initially by Protestantism. Martin Luther, who we'll meet in a minute, he started things off officially in 1517, and nothing's ever quite the same again. And so not only do you have the political division between the rivalries, whatever, between all these little states, but some of them are Protestant, some of them are still Catholic. Charles V himself was still devoutly Catholic, so was his son, obviously, Philip II. If you ever get to, no, you'll never go to Spain, will you? You have to go to the Escorial, which is a hike outside of Madrid. It's the palace, this enormous palace that Philip II built sort of in the middle of nowhere. And you go into the crypt part, and it's just, you have to know all the history to be amazed by it, but all around the room there are these coffins basically stacked up one on top of the other, and there's just one row of them. There's Charles V, his son Philip II, his son Philip III, and then his son Philip IV, who's the one immortalized by Velázquez. So you've got these four superstar kings, all just layered one on top of the other, just whoa. And there's somebody standing there making sure you don't take photographs, and so the one I got is very blurry, so can't show it to you, it's not worth it. Anyway, this is all the kind of the background of what goes on here, but initially at least most of the art is, as we'll see, is going to be Catholic, same old, same old. And what we're looking at first of all is this wonderful artist called Mathis Grunewald, Grunewald on the highlight sheet. Just means greenwood, basically. And these are not the major ones, so don't worry too much yet. We'll get to the superstar work in just a minute. But just to show you a little bit about his style. Because it was very popular at this time for, what we saw with people like even Compin, 100 years earlier almost. Remember the documents known about him was that he painted sculpture. And I said that was really a kind of way of setting a mindset, basically, because if you're sitting around all day putting colour on something three-dimensional, when you start to actually paint a flat picture, I think some of that's going to rub off on you, that roundness, the sense of mass, weight, volume, all that sort of stuff. And some of the pictures that Grunewald painted are quite sculptural in the way that the figures are done. And again, I don't want to bog you down with too many details here, but this is, it's called The Meeting of St. Erasmus and St. Maurice, or St. Maurice if you're English, 1517 to 23, something like that. So right about the start of the Protestant Reformation. 8.5 feet high. It actually looks like it might be smallish, but it isn't. With all sorts of lovely detail. One of the things that we see in Germanic art, I should probably put it that way, is the hugest influence of all is from the Spanish Netherlands, where we've been for the last few weeks. But a kind of trickle-down effect. There's some influence, I mean, even when we get to the next one, you see an influence of Bosch, for example. But mostly it's people like Gerard David, who are the sort of pretty picture painters, who just have a sort of sweetness to their art, which is diametrically opposed to what Grunewald's going to be doing, as we'll see. Just to point out a couple of fairly disgusting things. St. Erasmus, he's also known as St. Elmo. And if you sail, there's something called St. Elmo's Fire. It's something to do with standing. You have to be in a sailing ship, I guess, but a ship with masts and rigging and everything. And somehow Stanley anxiously gets into the mast and it all glows in a wonderful way. But he was a bishop. And so he's shown in his full regalia here. But his particularly disgusting form of martyrdom was to have his entrails wound out onto a sort of windlass thing, kind of whatever sailors would use to wind up ropes, so which is why I guess he's the patron saint of sailors. And that's actually what he's got. See, he's got the thingy there, and that's presumably his guts, his entrails all wrapped around it. So I thought you'd like to know about that. That's fairly disgusting. And this chappie here, this is St. Maurice, who was actually, he was Egyptian, and he was the head of something called the Theban Legions, which were a kind of almost a legendary group of soldiers who fought for the Romans. But he was Christian, so were all his soldiers Christians, and they fought they refused to kill Christians in the Roman Empire. So for that they were punished by being decimated. And that's one of those good words that you've totally lost the original meaning of it. They were decimated, you think they're all just wiped out completely. What the Romans would do to maintain discipline in the army, did I even talk about that? Maybe in another class somewhere. They would line everybody up, they'd go along 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, no, they didn't go, did they? But they did, chop. And then they do 1, 2, 3, the next 10. So decimated means just 1 in 10, that's not very exciting. But what they did with the Theban legions was, when decimation didn't work, they decimated them again, and then again, and in the end, so finally they wiped them all out. So it's the whole idea of dying for your faith. Because even old Erasmus, there's a wonderful painting by Poussin, which was originally in St. Peter's in Rome, and there's a life-size sketch for it in Ottawa of him lying there having his entrails wound out. But of course, he's quite happy about the whole thing because he's getting the eternal bliss. And actually it's good because, the guts are sort of going from here to there. And there's actually a pagan priest hovering over him saying, would you like to change your mind and worship our gods? And you might be a little bit too late if you're over here and your guts are over there. But anyway, you sort of get the point of the power of prayer and faith and all those sorts of ideas that were the sort of the message of Christian painting. These are the sort of role models, if you like. But see, this is another one that's, if you just saw this, you might almost think Bosch, because it's very claustrophobic. Sort of caricature-y faces, exaggerated poses, everything packed into the front part of the picture, basically. And it's called the mocking of Christ. When Christ, again, this is just before the crucifixion, he was crowned with thorns, he was the flagellation, all of that sort of stuff, general torturing and humiliation that goes on. People spit on him and do nasty things. And his eyes are covered over here, so he won't be able to recognize his torturers and get revenge on them later on. This one I should have, if you're counting days, I said to say that one, 15, 17, and 23. This one's about 1503, and it's in Munich. And so again, it's a little bit unpleasant somehow, all these, Christ is just kind of sitting there rather untouched by it all. But some of these characters are a little bit sort of buffoon-y somehow. So what we see with Grunewald is sort of the best and or the worst qualities perhaps of Germanic art, because the good qualities are things like directness, direct observation, honesty, truthfulness. He doesn't muck about old Grunewald. He doesn't get too stuck in the old conventions the way that everybody else is painted. He's very much his own man. The downside, at least to my wimpy taste, is almost a wallowing in ugliness and deformity and pain and suffering, stuff like that. Because this is a crucifix. He did about 20 smallish crucifixes like this, and you can see the absolute tortured body of Christ, all to do with physical pain and suffering. The arms almost pulled out of their sockets. The exaggerated emotions, John the Evangelist, Mary, the mother. I can't quite decide which. I think that's probably Mary Magdalene, but that might be. A couple more Marys down there anyway. And this is St. Longinus, we've probably met him before. He was the centurion who's dressed in surprisingly modern clothes for Grunewald's time. Who gets to say, truly this man was the Son of God. That sort of last second recognition of who Christ was, who's just before he died. And Christians love that, the sort of recognition of Christ. And that allows you to be blessed. He becomes St. Longinus, basically. Actually, St. Longinus, there's no name mentioned in the Bible. He's kind of blended together the saint, because he's got this big lance, and I think Longinus is actually Greek for a lance. So he's either, in the Bible it says, right towards the end, this fellow shoves his spear into Christ's side, the fifth wound, he's done it already, and the centurion, the one who does the recognizing. So they get kind of mixed together into St. Longinus. And so there are several of these which are really very similar. They get almost more grotesque from one to the other. He's awfully good at, can any of you do that? He's very good at sort of wringing hands, the physical distortion and contortion, as well as all the draperies which add up to the spiritual turmoil within the figure. And raggedy loincloths, and otherwise pretty well the same sorts of people. So there are several of these kinds of images that again display, for me anyway, a sort of rather sort of too much realism, if that's the right word. But he's a really interesting character. Somebody did a nice statue of him quite recently. It's rather nice. We don't actually know a lot about him at all. Actually, even his name wasn't Grunewald. There was an art historian in the 17th century who either made a mistake or just made it up or confused him with somebody else. His real name was Matthias Gotthard Neidhardt, but if you call him that, nobody will know who you're talking about. So just call him Grunewald. And his dates are, 1470-75 to 1528. He's almost exactly the same time as Dürer.
What is the name of the painting?
Grunewald. He's on your highlight sheet. Grunewald. You got him?
No.
It's on my list.
Oh, the name of the artist.
Well, yeah.
The name of the painting.
What painting? Oh, that one? Oh, it's just the crucifixion.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not important. The major one's coming up just a second.
Okay, thanks.
So anyway, this is him sort of looking quite thoughtful. I like the sticking out of statues all over the place. Probably is more entitled Würzburg, which I found it, it's right there. See, right almost about as in the middle as you could possibly get. And he's recorded there. There's another, see, that's a third, different one. They all look sort of the same until you put them side by side. Recorded there, first of all in 1500 as an independent artist, so again you're guessing that he's 25, 30, something like that. So that's how you kind of work backwards to when he might have been born. And then he died, as I say, in 1528 in a place, he was actually a little bit closer over to what's now Holland. And roughly he's contemporary to Raphael down in Italy as well, just to put him into a wider context. And he produced a very small number of pictures, really, and I think only about 20 or so survive. And a lot of them, about half of them, are scenes of Christ's Passion, things like this. And part of the reason for the small output is that probably he spent at least 4, maybe even 6 years on his masterpiece, which is this thing called the Isenheim Altarpiece, and that's on your highlight sheet. Isenheim. And this is how it's displayed nowadays. I think, I'm hoping this is a fairly recent picture. Actually, I don't know if it's just the Germanic artists who do this, but he was sort of multitasking. First of all, he was court painter. That's always the best job if you're an artist. You become a sort of stable of artists to some noble person. And he actually hooked up with 2 successive archbishops of Mainz, M-A-I-N-Z, and for one of them he also acted as supervisor or clerk of the works. So he was sort of a general contractor. He rebuilt the palace. He was this is a good German word, Wasserkunstmacher, which means water art maker. So he designed fountains, basically. That's rather a nice sort of side job, I guess. But he also, architect and restorer of buildings as much as anything else. Very little painting during the last couple of years of his life, because, again, like lots of other artists, but particularly in Germany, he was involved in politics. And there was something called the Peasants' Revolt of 1525. The peasants were always revolting and rising up against the old feudal families. And he took the side of the peasants, which, if you're working for the aristocracy, probably isn't the brightest thing to do. If you want to keep your job. And he also almost certainly was a Protestant, towards the end of his life at least, because when he died, they went through his stuff, and they found what was called much Lutheran trash. All the writings, the teachings, the preachings of Martin Luther. And that was punishable by, certainly by trial, maybe even by death, just to eliminate all kinds of heresy. So this thing called the Isenheim Altarpiece, we're going to look at this for quite a while, because it's not just what you see here, this is rather clever, rising up, it's all of that, all the way to the far end, in fact a bit more. So this is an think in terms of the Ghent altarpiece by Van Dyck. You've got all these bits and pieces all cobbled together, and it would have been a very complicated folding and closing system, so that again you could only really see one at a time. And now they've got it arranged in a kind of museum-like setting, where you just stagger your way down through the whole lot to see each of the three separate areas. Now, what you have to remember is the original occasion. Remember with just in Rogier's Last Judgment, which was in the hospital, or the poorhouse, where all the poor dying folk were sort of gazing at this vision of heaven and hell at the end of the room. This again is context, because it was in the Antonite monastery. Antonite just means the monastery dedicated to Saint Anthony in this town called Isenheim, which is in Alsace, which is sort of almost between France and Germany, near a town called Colmar, where I've never been either. But it was a very wealthy monastery. It was founded around 1300 or so, and the specific job of the place was to heal the sick. And they specialized in diseases like epilepsy, syphilis, and the plague. And the various saints that you can see here, because if you look at the principal, well, I'll just go back to that one for a second, because that's St. Sebastian, that's St. Anthony over here, the two Johns, John the Evangelist, John the Baptist in the middle part. And they were all saints who were, if you got certain diseases, you would pray to a particular saint. So against the plague, you would pray to St. Sebastian. I think both Johns you would pray if you had epilepsy. And Anthony against all sorts of other diseases as well, particularly ergot poisoning. I think I maybe mentioned that even with Bosch, because some people think that he just went nuts. Ergot poisoning, which is bad wheat, basically. So if you ate bread that was tainted, you went mad, you frothed at the mouth and everything else. So when they put them in the hospital, they fed them lots of good bread and all sorts of magic potions that the monks had been concocting over the centuries. So the altarpiece itself that we're looking at here was very much part of the healing process. Presumably all these poor, sickly characters would have been wheeled in, sat in front of this, and would have to sort of learn the method. So we look on it nowadays sort of as a work of art, but for them it was part of the overall cure, I guess you could say. Now, the very, very back bit, I'm not sure why the side wings aren't there, because these are the bits that are actually bought. This was actually, I won't even give you the name because it'll just be more confusing, but by a sculptor. And one of the things, again, that they did at this time, there's a fellow called Parker, who you could look up, P-A-C-H-E-R, altarpieces like this, which are sculptural and then painted. I mean, this is all 3D, polychrome, usually wood. Unbelievably realistic and naturalistic, just because of all the colours. And that was the first bit commissioned by one of the heads of this monastery. But the successor of that one, that was all done just after 1500. The next fellow commissions, that's the middle bit there, commissions from Grunewald all the rest of the painted part of the altarpiece. And his name, I'll give you his name, it's Guido Guerci. G-U-E-R-S-I. And all of the heads of they were all aristocrats, either French or Italian, enormously rich. Now, I think we've sort of seen maybe that kind of thing before, that if you were from one of these noble families, the oldest son, it was always the oldest son got the lot. They got the title, the land, and everything else. Second son would probably go into the army, get his own stuff. Third son probably went into the church. So there were an awful lot of rich bishops and cardinals and people who just came from the wealthy families, who, again, weren't exactly driven by divine calling to be holy or anything. But it sort of did well in a case like this, because a monastery like Isenheim was extraordinarily well funded. So if you're going to be sick, you might as well be sick here. So this is just to sort of suck these two together. What we have are two, this is now all Bosch, and he began it, well, you'd see different dates, maybe even as early as 1509 rather. And certainly had finished it by 1515. And again, you have to figure this would be a sort of full-time job, which is why he isn't doing a lot of other stuff as well. So, Guido Guerci is in fact, we'll meet him again in a minute, this figure over here, who is, again, a very, very rich man, and he was, he was a St. Paul, St. Anthony himself. Now what happened was, you see, if you were mostly male figures, it was sort of a guy thing, with the exception of people like Mary Magdalene and Mary Vidia. You went off into the desert and you cleansed yourself, and I bet an awful lot of mushroom eating and things like that went on as well, because they had visions. Particularly, well, but it may be much more fun in a way with this one, because usually Anthony has all sorts of wonderful sexual fantasies, and all these beautiful ladies are all hanging around, playing with his toes and things. But in this case, it's all just these monstrous creatures who are sort of dredged up from the subconscious. And again, if I just showed you a detail like that, you would probably think Bosch, because it is very Boschian. And about the same time as Bosch. So there's no way. Remember, Bosch was working pretty much in isolation. Not even in one of the main centres like Brussels. So I don't think anybody could have known his work outside of his little neighbourhood, basically. So maybe it's just a sort of common ancestry with some of these wonderfully ghoulish demons and ghosties and creatures. But here's poor old Anthony, being tempted, and well, not so much tempted here, but more tortured by all sorts of kind of representation. But even with Bosch, we saw sort of hybrid creatures who would they were perversions of God's will, basically. So these are heretical thoughts and superstitious ideas, anything that goes bump in the night. And I think Northern artists are much better than Italians at doing those sort of things. They have much more of a sort of spooky tradition than the well-behaved Italians. So you just sort of zoom around. I think I've actually got some fairly nice details to get in on. Yeah, they're pretty good. He's very good at silhouettes and these sort of raggedy beasties and sort of dripping fronds and things. And you're not quite sure if these are good creatures coming to rescue him or yet more bad influences, as it were. And there's gods up in the heavens. I mean, he's got his orb and his scepter looking like the king of the heavens, basically. And he's not really bothered at all. He's just sort of sitting up there, overseeing everything. And again, you see here come all these little flying creatures. So are these angels coming to help Anthony out, or are they the sort of fall of the rebel angels, which were Lucifer and all of the other continuing bad stuff? And then there's this is a pretty good creature. That's worthy of Bosch in its own way. Sort of nibbling away at his fingers, so this primordial armadillo-like thingy. And he's got his rosary in his hand, but I'm not sure if that's helping him all that much. And then this absolutely repulsive creature who lies in the corner, and he's sort of, I mean, this is about as foul as you can get, I think. Well, until, hang on for about another 10-15 minutes or something to get worse. But anyway, this is what this figure sort of represents, is sort of all of suffering mankind, I think. I mean, you cannot get much more pain than this. I mean, it's genuinely repulsive. All of the body covered in dreadful, open, festering sores. In the Bible, Job, if you remember, Job was covered in sore boils. I wonder, are there any other kinds of boils other than sore boils? But anyway, these are definitely sore boils, I think, here. And so he is all absolutely sort of agonized. Now, again, what you have to remember is that St. Anthony will overcome all of these ghoulies and beasties because of the strength of his faith. And so, all these demonic beings have no ultimate power over him. But also, I think, the idea of the healing powers that he has, because, again, thinking of where we are, we're in a hospital with people who have, maybe not quite this disgusting, but they've also got sore bits. So then they're sitting there thinking that, well, if he can overcome them, he can help me as well. So it's all about helping, sort of psychological curing the unfortunate people who are in the hospital itself. The other side has this rather nice episode where St. Anthony, again, he's been actually back in the desert for a long time. He's about 90 years old, and he's suffering from the sin of pride, because he thinks he's the hoariest old hermit in the world, basically. And then somehow he gets to hear about St. Paul, not the real Paul, another Paul called Paul the Hermit, who was living in a nearby desert, and he was 113. And so off he goes, sort of as a gesture of humility, off he goes, he travels across through his desert into St. Paul's desert, and they have a lovely meeting, and then they just go their separate ways, and that's it. So sort of, you're not quite sure what the point of the story is, but anyway, that's it. And getting going to the AGO collection, there's an lovely painting by Mattia Preti, who was Italian 17th century, where Paul is sort of going, wow, because what happened was every day for 102 years, whatever it was, this great raven black bird had brought him a loaf of bread. That was how he survived in the desert, which is not a very good desert, come to think of it, is it? It looks a bit lush, all this stuff here. Anyway, that's the reason he's surprised in the AGO picture is that the bird has brought double rations. So he realizes he's going to have a visitor. And again, in the AGO picture, there's this tiny little figure sort of plodding up in the background, and that's St. Anthony. But here, the actual meeting of the two, and he's obviously got a lot of time on his hands because he's knitting himself this wonderful outfit here. It's really quite spiffy. And this kind of scrawny, bony, I mean, that's really quite well done. There's a lot of kind of pointing and gesturing in the altarpiece. And again, what even I should say with the bread, I mean, that is Eucharistic, you know, the body of Christ, that sort of thing. So people back then would certainly thought in those lines. But also what we have to see here is that this wonderfully knitted outfit, but that's actually a self-portrait of Grunewald, the painter. And then St. Anthony is actually a portrait of this Guido Guerci fellow. And again, quite sympathetically down, I think. In fact, down at the bottom bit, you can see Guido Guerci's coat of arms, which is not what you usually have out in the desert, so obviously it's just to sort of help to identify him. So again, these two nice old geezers hanging around together. But it's sort of lunar landscape and fanciful and almost comic book stuff. But then there are other really lovely naturalistic bits. Look at this deer of some kind that's sort of, you know, I mean, you hate to sort of think of it, but it must have been painted from a dead animal, I guess, to get it to stay still long enough. But even so, it's beautifully done in a faithfully true kind of way. And then you get all of this raggedy, mossy, kind of B-movie backcloth, basically. But it's quite good. Again, the sort of the coming together of the two figures. I should have actually mentioned, because went all the way back to the two figures of these warriors, or the bishop and the warrior. You can see even here they're in a pose of discussion, and it's sort of assumed that they're talking about theological stuff, because again, when you think these pictures are painted, they're all around the time when people start, well, nervous might be one word for it, but they're getting very worried about truth, because for centuries there was only one way, and that was the way, you know, the truth from Rome, and they would just sort of write down, believe this, and everybody went along with it. But now suddenly people were questioning and doubting. So even here you get the idea of a discussion going on. But it's not that either one is taking the Protestant side or the Catholic side, I don't think, because this is certainly a Catholic institution, they're not going to be allowed to do that. But just the idea of a conversation that's going on. So the next stage when you move in is the Nativity at the centre with Mary and the Christ child. The Annunciation over the left, we've seen that now 826 times, but never quite like this. And the resurrection on this side. So it's really the beginning and the end of Christ's life. Not even quite arrived yet and leaving on the right-hand side. Alpha, Omega, basically, the beginning and the end. Underneath that, though, you can see just from the shape, the scene of the lamentation, which is when Christ's body is taken down from the cross, and he's been mourned over by John the Evangelist, John the Evangelist, Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene, who's doing a bit of hand-wringing, more of that there. And it's a good scene for a predella, because it's long and it's skinny. We'll see an amazing one by Holbein in a couple of weeks. So you can kind of stretch it out along the length of the composition there. Then up in the main part, again you can see how all these should or could fold over basically, but not anymore. The Annunciation, which is relatively straightforward. But actually, and I'm never going to have time, or I can't be bothered anyway, but just to find out how many Annunciations, important ones, does Gabriel come from this side, from the right, rather? Because normally all the ones that we've seen, he's on, or nearly all of them, he's on the left side with Mary over here. No, I don't think it makes a blind bit of difference, but that might be just compositional, whatever. But he comes swirling in, and look at this amazing drapery, all just swooshing, as if he's just, flown in from heaven, basically. Barely touching the ground, just a little tip. And she's a little bit kind of blown away by all of this great announcement. A little bit of hand-wringing, shying backwards, sort of psychologically more powerful. And some of them are really just keeps on reading. Little dove of the Holy Spirit hovering around there. And it's a lovely interior of a Gothic church. And up in the corner, as if, where there would be sculpture in a church probably, this, again, a rather odd, skinny figure. This would be Isaiah, who was the old, I mentioned David Cameron, he was the Old Testament prophet, most closely associated with, he writes about virgin births and things like that. So it's always assumed that Mary reading the good book. I can't zoom in that much. She's gone fuzzy. Reading a bit out of Isaiah. She might be. Anyway, but it's just sort of different. Again, the amount of emotion that's contained within everything, big gestures, all of that sort of stuff makes it a little bit different. There she is again. And she's not exactly the conventionally pretty Mary either. I mean, maybe to a German around 1500 she might be, but it's not the way that we're kind of used to seeing her, and neither is he really either. So again, he's sort of going his own way a little bit. The central, this is rather lovely because this is a nativity scene, but it's odd, isn't it? Because look at if you zoom in on the Christ child, again, a not terribly pretty Mary, but the Christ child is all sort of broken and falling apart. I mean, he's not exactly heroic. He's actually fiddling with what appear to be rosary beads, which of course haven't been invented yet. I mean, all these anachronisms, like the book, because we haven't got books yet either, but that's all right. But they appear to be made out of coral, and we've met coral before, because coral wards off evil, and so does Christ, and he gets to hang around with coral all the time. And as you can see, there's a little annunciation to the shepherds happening over there. Up above, again, there's more announcements. No, that's that bit, isn't that? Yeah, it's that bit right there. That's another God up in heaven overseeing everything. So it's a very oddly imaginative little architectural space that this accompanying orchestra is hanging out in. But then it's odd, isn't it? Because there's God kind of hovering above the angel, and there's nobody's that we've seen in this course has ever painted like this. It's almost impressionistic, isn't it? Just sort of suggesting space and depth rather than trying to pin it down in a very specific kind of way. And this is almost my favourite part of the argument. Oh no, sorry, I forgot. I've got just a detail in the middle bit, because very often the little baby Jesus is having a little bath from the little midwifey people. So that's a nice sort of bucket there. And we've seen before glass containers with stoppers, that was symbols of Mary's purity. And Roger, see, this almost looks like it doesn't belong. It looks quite modern. This little potty. And because somebody, I showed that the other day in a lecture, and somebody said it's just a mishmash of sort of pseudo-Hebraic letters. Anybody know any better than that? I think it is. Because you should think that Yammalite probably got it right. He'd have probably gone and asked a rabbi, what could I write on the potty here? But do you all know the origin of the chamber pot? Do you even call it a chamber pot? You should, because that's what it is. It goes under your bed. And it all happened because in the Houses of Parliament in England, a long time ago, there was a Speaker of the House who was getting on a bit, and he started to have bladder problems. He kept having to go for a pee. And whenever he was away, they couldn't carry on the business of the House because the Speaker had to be there. So somebody clever rigged up a curtain around his throne, his chair, and they put this thing under his throne. And so when he had to go to the pee, he just closed the curtains, did it, and so they could keep talking in the Houses of Parliament. Very efficient. And because they were in the chamber of the House, they called it the chamber pot, you see. Do you read that? I do. So, here's my lovely orchestra. And I was trying to figure out, because I don't play any instruments, but not anymore. I don't think that's quite how you would hold the bow.
It's wrong.
Yeah, but it's not. See, it's not quite a cello, which should have 4 strings. So because I mean, even there's a sort of an almost getting towards a violin over there. They haven't quite got the violin yet. If you know Caravaggio, he does his famous lute player. There's a lovely violin sitting in the front of the lute, which is they just developed that. So that's just before 1600 in a place called Cremona in Italy. They are a sort of modern form of the violin. But look, I mean, this is look at this chappie here. It's unbelievably weird and wonderful. And then there are odd little hobbit-like creatures lurking in the background. I think this is beautiful, that face, in a surreal kind of way. And again, I mean, how can you possibly have fingers like that? Is that natural chord, do you think? Did you play the cello? That's close. I used to play trumpet, so you can't make me give demonstrations on the French horn and things, but they assumed it was the same. Does that look like a real chord? Because I mean, you have to have weird fingers to be able to do that. So everything is sort of broken and bent and wonderful. I mean, how long can that arm be there? It sort of appears nice, but then it's just all sort of surreal in a way that it's quite wonderful. I love these feathers and that face, it just jumps right out at you. Almost distractingly. Anyway, the final scene is the resurrection, which again is where, this is Easter Sunday now, where the soldiers guarding the tomb fall asleep, up pops Christ, zooms straight up into heaven. And it's almost like he's being blown heavenwards by sort of divine whoosh ascension. And he's silhouetted, not quite the right word, against this great aureole of light, in the pose almost of the crucifixion, displaying the wounds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the side there. I mean, it really is. There's very few artists, I think, who've been able to paint kind of true spirituality. Because what you've got to see, the whole point about Christ being born as a man, or God being born as a man, was now you've got sort of half man, half spirit, if you like. And now you're kind of transforming back into the spiritual side. So your physicality is disappearing into a sort of godliness. And that's hard to do. The other one I sort of think is William Blake, who's the wonderfully crazy English poet, painter, everything, just after 1800 basically. He's pretty good as well. But this is rather nice. But again, as I say, we've started with the Annunciation, now we've got to the far end, with the sort of beginning of the next life, I guess you could say. But look at that, I mean, extraordinarily well detailed. The soldiers, more so than a lot of the other parts, which are, again, as I said, almost expressionistic. But look at that chappie here. You don't have to fall quite as cleverly towards that. I mean, it's so well done, you sort of don't really notice until you stop and look at it that obviously it's painted on a flat surface, but he's falling towards it. So it's another little area where you just keep coming back and sort of a little bit takes you away from the main message of the image somehow. So the final opening is the scariest one of the whole lot. And I think this would probably be the most seen. Assuming that you had it open, this would be the most popular opening. But now it's in the sort of museological setting, you see it all the time basically. So what we see here is the crucifixion in the central panel, still the entombment down below. Saint Sebastian and Saint Anthony in the right hand. Actually, again, if I was clever enough to do Photoshop, I would like to flip the wings. In fact, I think I've even seen reproductions, because I think he would be better over there. Because, you know, it's a little bit like, it's more hand-wringing, but it's sort of pointing that way. And I think if he were in that wing, he'd be sort of echoing the gesture of John the Baptist, who's still going sort of, there is one who cometh after me. Right there, but he's still telling us. Anyway, I think that's my little quibble about that, which isn't important at all. So this is Anthony, and we saw his temptation a couple of minutes ago with all those googly. In fact, there's quite a nice one still landing up there. We've seen lots and lots of bottle glass. This is not the best bottle glass at all, is it? I mean, it's just kind of boring bottle glass, but you're having a little go, I suppose. And anyway, here he is. But this is another thing that we've seen, even all the way back to Gandolfini, is the idea of sort of sculpture rule figures. Because, I mean, it's very real, sort of portrait-like almost. And standing there fully covered, you're on a pedestal, basically, as if you are a piece of sculpture. So, you know, remember the Gandolfinis on the outside, we saw the grisaille figures of the two Johns, basically. This is sort of a continuation of that. He has this thing called the Tau cross, T-A-U, the Greek for the letter T, that particular shape of the cross that he carries. And he's quite nice and kind of pretty grand figure. On this side, where he shouldn't be, is Saint Sebastian. And look at that lovely piece of string. I mean, that's something that you don't really need to have there. All the sort of nice shadows with extra arrows. In case you, and there's more arrows down there. But he too is up on a pedestal, basically. Have we had Saint Sebastian before? I hate to keep repeating him. But he's rather good because he was, I think, 4th century. Time of Diocletian. He was an officer in the Praetorian Guard. And if you watch your old Gladiator movie, they're the sort of elite troops whose job was to be the bodyguard for the emperor. So they were the most highly trained of the whole lot. And he converted to Christianity and was discovered, and so was condemned to death to be executed by his own troops. And so usually you see him sort of almost like a Christ-like figure, body beautiful, up on a sort of cross, shot full of arrows. And what happens is that either he didn't train his troops all that well, or they sort of missed him on purpose because they don't actually kill him. After that horrible experience, he's nursed back to health by, I think her name was Saint Irene, a virtuous Roman widow. There were all sorts of virtuous Roman widows running around when he needed one. Anyway, he feels a bit better. He goes back to the emperor and says, "Hello, remember me, the Christian." And then he's clubbed to death and his body thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, which was the main sewer in Rome. Now that's not very picturesque. I think I've only found one painting ever of his body being thrown into the sewer, because it's much better to have him as this sort of idealized, beautiful figure, again echoing antique ideals of Kalos, beautiful inside, beautiful outside. But this is Grunewald, so he's not quite the same, but he is sort of the pincushion type. And somebody pointed out, you know, if you got the plague, apparently the saw bits hit you on certain points, and so Saint Sebastian, the other one who's invoked against the plague was Saint Roch, and he's often shown there with all these, again, sort of festering sores. But very often, if the artist knows what they're doing, sort of, the arrows are actually going into the spots where the saw bits would appear if you had the plague. And these aren't, they're just sort of on one, that's, yeah, a couple in the leg, that's not going to do much good. So this is just sort of almost decoration to be, have the sort of pincushion effect. But he's another one, which again, sort of big expression, big gestures, things like that. And you know he's going to be okay. Actually, it's rather a nice little open view to beautiful. I think this is ivy. And ivy was sort of loyalty, because ivy clings, so it sort of shows his faith, basically. And there's a little sort of, I'm not sure about it. If I saw these two coming, I think I would run if I could. But they are they're bringing the crown of martyrdom, and they look like, did you see, there's an awful British here called Little Britain. There was one very tall, skinny guy, one short, fat guy, and he looks a bit like that there, if you put on bad hair. Anyway, I mean, it's just odd, isn't it? Because you can't ever quite explain Grunewald. Sometimes he's really quite strikingly ordinary and wonderful, and then the next minute he does thingies like that. I think they're thingies with the crown of martyrdom. Anyway, the bad, scary part is this central scene, which is quite gruesomely graphic. And I think, you almost have to go, I don't know if it's specifically Germanic thing, but you have to go into German expressionism, I think, in the 20th century to get images that are equally direct as this. Because certainly, well, just, we'll get to the figure of Christ in just a second, but John the Baptist, again, what he's actually saying here is, he's not saying there's one who cometh after me for once, he's saying, in translation, he must increase while I diminish. Because in fact there was quite a strong cult of John the Baptist as a sort of Messiah in his own right, but obviously when Christ comes along, he sort of fades into the background. And by this point, officially, he's dead anyway, so again, it's a kind of theological compilation. But he's still got the nice little lamb, which is Christ, and he's bleeding into the chalice. We've seen that, and the sacrificial lamb. And then on the other side, you have Mary. Well, this is Mary Magdalene, again, the big emotional, sort of like an opera singer, kind of glaring out. And with her ointment jar, she carries that everywhere. And they did X-ray. Apparently Mary originally was standing up, and then he thought it would be more powerful to have her swooning backwards, being supported by John the Evangelist. Christ, at the very, very end, actually tells John the Evangelist to look after his mother, so that's essentially why they have that sort of close relationship here. But then you sort of zoom in on the body of Christ itself, which is, I'm not going any further in than that, but it's really quite brutally gruesome, I think you'd have to say, in every way, because it's all about physical torture and suffering and agony. If you took the arms almost sort of pulled out of the sockets, if you dangled them down, then the arms would come down about here, halfway deep and below his knees somehow. And then the rib cage all kind of blasting through, all of the sores and from the beatings and the whippings and all the other tortures that he's gone through. The bared teeth, everything, the skin pulled tight over his entire body. The crown of thorns itself, another instrument of torture somehow. So physical agony is obviously very much stressed to, again in an almost expressionistic way, just to emphasize Christ's physical suffering on the cross. But because of that, that makes the idea of victory over death, of the resurrection, all of that becomes that much more powerful, I guess you would say. That's certainly the point of the thing. The spiritual suffering leads to physical suffering, rather, leads to spiritual victory. And again, think where this is. In the hospital, seen daily by all these poor suffering characters. So the image itself would, in a strange way, I think, have provided, or the meaning was to provide comfort for people. Because when you see him, you realize that your problems aren't really all that. But I found a nice little letter from Martin Luther to his mother, who was actually on her deathbed. And he said, "This sickness should not distress or depress you. On the contrary, you should accept it with thankfulness as a token of God's grace, recognizing how slight a suffering it is, even if it be sickness unto death, compared with the sufferings of his own dear Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who did not suffer for himself as we do, but for us and for our sins." So that, again, if you were in the context of the hospital, you're not feeling very well, have a look at that. Do you think it would work? I don't think it would work for me. But if you really believe, then it would, I think. Certainly that's the point of it. So you maximize Christ's suffering just to make the discomfort that you see here, just to make whatever the patient is going through seem pretty petty in comparison. And again, nowadays, if we look at it as art with a capital A, back then it was functional, basically. So all of this tormented quality, I think, might even reflect something of Grunewald's own personality. Because you have to, I'm talking all about the context of the Isenheim Altarpiece, where the poor sickos are looking at this and feeling a bit better about things. But what about all those other small crucifixes, where there was equal suffering and tortured figures and distorted, grotesque? That's not in the context of a hospital, so I think maybe he just rather enjoys doing this sort of thing. Who knows? But he is certainly different. So actually, that's just before we get on to the next artist. I will, because we can break in 5 minutes. I just want to just sort of go through business for a minute, because as I said, some of you came in quite a bit late, so please do sign in. And as I said, I forgot to print out a sign-out sheet, so sign it on the right-hand column to make sure you're here. The schedule, as I said, we're doing Cranach and Grunewald Cranach today, and I'll probably get to Dura. Then we still have to do Holbein. He'll probably trickle into the final week on August the 15th, where I've got catch-up and review, so I'm not going to do that for 3 hours. So add Holbein's name to that, because he's on the highlight list. Now, essays, have you all got your essays finished?
Yeah, I wrote it.
Did you?
Yeah, I finished.
And you're expecting bonus marks, aren't you?
Yeah.
Good luck with that. No, if you haven't done it, give it in. But as you know, we did postpone the deadline till Monday. Now that also means, because I did say, that if you're late, there's a 2% per day penalty. And I guess since I delayed the deadline, I should delay the real deadline to the following Monday. And I'm quite right, I don't count weekends in that. So you could lose 10% if you hand it in a week late. After that, I don't accept it at all. Doesn't matter, deaths in the family. I'm not going to accept it. It's not fair to the TA who's marking them all. And people take advantage if when I'm too nice and they hand it in 3 weeks late. I said earlier that a summer course, you can't hand in incomplete marks. For some reason, I have no idea why, but you can't. So all the final marks, after the exam, after the essays, there's a deadline that I have to hand them in. So that's why the essays have to be in on time. So what happens though is, because in the good old days, maybe some of you remember, where you could actually take your late essay to the office and they would date stamp it, and that meant that it was done, and then we go into my mailbox. They don't do that anymore because they have 100 people a day. So what you do, if you are going to be a little bit late, email it to me, and then I know that you've done it. And you're sort of then on your honor not to go back and keep working on it. Because I don't print it out. I'm like, there are probably 15 of you who are going to be late, and I'm not going to print out 15 essays. But then you just bring in your paper to the next class. But when you've emailed it to me, I stop sucking off 2%. Does that make sense? So any questions, I'll write a little note about that on my courses thing as well, just to make sure that it's all legally in print, basically. So if you've got any questions still on my essays, I hope they come speak to me now, because obviously I haven't got that much time left. So it's 25 to. Let's be back here at 5 to 4. 20-minute break.